Hi, I'm Bill Spalding. Welcome to WCS Money Tutorials. Today's topic is virtually risk-free agency bonds that are now paying almost 7% in some cases. Agency bonds are issued by agencies of the U.S. government, and GSE bonds are issued by government-sponsored enterprises, which are private corporations created by the federal government to promote socially desirable goals, such as providing low-cost loans for farmers and for lower-income Americans to enable them to buy a home. Agency bonds are free or virtually free of credit default risk, and they pay a higher interest rate than comparable treasuries. Longer-term agency bonds usually have a higher spread over comparable treasuries, as you can see in this graph. The average yield over treasuries also varies. The yield spread increases during economic uncertainty, probably because many investors worry about whether the government will actually back some agency bonds. The spread may also increase when interest rates drop because many agency bonds are callable, so they are more likely to be called. There are two types of issuers of these bonds. Some of these issuers are actual agencies of the United States government. Other issuers are government-sponsored enterprises, quasi-governmental entities established by Congress to enhance the flow of credit to specific sectors of the U.S. economy, not by lending money directly, but by guaranteeing third-party loans and purchasing those loans from loan originators, which are then securitized into bonds, which are sold to investors. Because GSEs are self-funded, they are not direct obligations of the U.S. government, so these bonds will not be affected by a government shutdown. To prevent a lot of repetition, I will refer to both agency bonds and GSE bonds as agency bonds, unless there is a specific reason to distinguish them. Bonds issued directly by an agency of the federal government are backed by the full faith and credit of the U.S. government, just like treasuries. By contrast, GSE bonds have only implicit backing by the U.S. government, meaning that most investors believe that the U.S. government would not let GSE bonds default. The reason for this belief is that these bonds supply credit to several important industries, such as for farming and for housing. If a default would occur and the government did not step in and make investors whole, then interest rates would rise in these types of bonds, making it more expensive to finance credit for these important industries. Consequently, GSE bonds are virtually risk-free, but since they are not completely risk-free, they pay a slightly higher interest rate. Some GSE bonds are not backed by the government, but are instead backed by the revenues generated by the projects financed by the bonds, such as the bonds issued by the Tennessee Valley Authority. Has the government ever prevented the default of GSE bonds? Yes. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, GSEs that issued mortgage-backed securities, were in fact bailed out by the federal government when they were placed under a conservatorship in 2008 during the Great Recession, which has reinforced the belief that GSE bonds are implicitly backed by the federal government. The stockholders were wiped out, but the holders of the mortgage-backed securities issued by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac did not suffer any credit losses, despite substantial defaults by individual borrowers. This does not guarantee that the federal government will support GSE bonds in the future, but considering the importance of these bonds to the economy, it is likely that such support will continue. These are the major issuers of agency bonds, which includes the Federal Home Loan Banks and Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, and even includes the United States Postal Service. Like treasuries, the interest from all agency and GSE bonds are taxable by the federal government, and several types of these bonds, displayed in red, are also subject to state or local tax. But some GSE and agency bonds, displayed in black, are exempt from state and local taxes. Agency and GSE bonds do have some interest rate risk when interest rates are low, because bond prices always decline when interest rates rise. The decline in price that occurred from 2021 to 2023 is a result, of course, of rising interest rates. However, when interest rates are high, as they are now, that interest rate sensitivity translates into potential capital gains, as you can see from this graph from the end of 2018 to March 2020, when interest rates were decreasing. Unlike treasuries, many agency bonds are callable, meaning that the issuer can redeem the bond before maturity. The earliest date that the bonds can be called is referred to as the call date, and most bonds can be called at any time after that date. Sometimes the issuer will pay a call premium, which is a higher price than the face value when redeeming the bond before maturity, but most agency bonds do not pay a call premium. Bonds are more likely to be called if interest rates are lower on the call date or thereafter than when the bond was issued. Therefore, callable bonds have reinvestment risk, meaning that you may have to reinvest your money for a lower interest rate for the same amount of risk. However, longer-term callable bonds usually pay a higher rate of interest than comparable treasuries because of their call risk. Notice how the yields differ between U.S. Treasuries and agency bonds. Rates for bonds with terms of 1 year or less are very comparable, but for terms exceeding 1 year, agency bonds pay a higher yield. Many of the longer-term agency bonds are callable, so they pay a higher yield than treasuries with comparable terms. Long-duration bonds have a greater capital gain potential when interest rates decline, but callable bonds have much less potential for capital gains, since it is likely they will be called if interest rates decline. Check out my video on how to find the bonds with the greatest potential for capital gains by understanding bond duration. The link is provided in the description and in the upper right-hand corner of this screen. The callability feature of bonds will affect the price of the bond and also change its yield. For most agency bonds, the call price equals face value. All bonds have a yield to maturity that would be different from the nominal yield if the bond was purchased at a premium or discount to face value. Yield to maturity will depend on how much time remains until maturity, but callable bonds will also have a yield to call, which is calculated like the yield to maturity, but the call date is substituted for the maturity date, and the call price or call premium, if any, is substituted for face value, though most agency bonds just pay the face value. Bonds also have a yield to worst, equal to the lowest yield of a bond that could occur because of call provisions, prepayments, or other features affecting cash flows. The yield to call will be higher than the yield to maturity for bonds bought at a discount, since the gain from the discount will be received sooner. If the bond was bought at a premium, then the yield to call will equal the yield to worst for most bonds, which will be less than the yield to maturity. Broker listings for bonds show both the yield to worst and the yield to maturity. Most people buy their agency bonds from brokers, who purchase them in large blocks, then resell them to their customers. Brokers determine the minimum purchases, which in most cases is $1,000, but some brokers may require a minimum purchase of 5 or 10 securities, resulting in a minimum purchase of $5,000 or $10,000, respectively. I will illustrate how you could buy at Fidelity as an example. First select Products, then Fixed Income, Bonds, and CDs. Then click on Search for Investments. Here you can get a quick overview of the yields available for all types of bonds, including corporate and municipal bonds. Click on Agency Bonds. Here you can look at secondary bonds and new issue bonds. Just click on the new issue link to see the new issues. Then click on Agency GSE. Then you will see a list of new agency bonds. Click the description of one of the bonds to see more details. Notice that this bond pays 6.82%, which is much higher than treasuries for virtually the same amount of risk. One reason why the yield is so high is because this bond is callable. Even though the maturity date is 2043, it will almost certainly be called long before then. So these types of bonds do not have much potential for capital gain. To see more details on the call provision, click on View Schedule. The earliest call date for this bond is May 24, 2024, 6 months after the issue date. While you may only own the bond for 6 months, the yield is much higher than for a 26-week treasury, and if yields are still pretty high in May 2024, then you may get this good yield for longer. Thank you very much for your time. If you liked my video, please give me a thumbs up and subscribe. I would appreciate any suggestions, so please leave them in the comments below. Check out my website at thismatter.com for more than 850 in-depth fundamental tutorials in personal finance, investments, and economics. Check out my books on money at williamspalding.com. Thank you.